Hey everyone, welcome back to Inventing Construction. I'm Ross Griffin, and today we have a very special guest, Patrick Moloney. But before Patrick introduces himself, let me introduce the main topics. We're going to be defining circular economy today. It's a very big topic and subject at the moment. Basically, what we're saying is how we're living today is not how we're going to be living in the future. Everything is going to change, not just in construction, but in society. The subtopics is, well, what is circular economy? How and why is it different to sustainability? A lot of people kind of interact both of them together or connect them. Patrick hopefully will define that for us. How is it affecting industries like the construction industry? And what is the future going to look like for us in construction, but also as society? But Patrick, before you introduce yourself, you had a great phrase. You came out one night when we were having a beer. What was it?
Nothing is impossible when it's inevitable. And I believe our circular future isn't inevitable. Now, I don't think it's fully originally my thought. Yeah. I think I remember seeing something somewhere to do with it, but I've circularized this, for want of a better description.
Can you introduce yourself, who you are, what you're doing, and more importantly, why are you sitting in that seat opposite me?
I'm sitting in the seat opposite you because we met 15 years ago.
That's right.
I think we were only a month off the boat, both of us, to Copenhagen, bumped into each other at a pub watching a rugby match.
That's right, yeah.
And I've known each other ever since. So I suppose that's the first reason why I'm here. The second reason why I'm here is that I work a lot in the circular economy space, the nexus with circular economy and sustainability. My current role, I'm director for sustainability consulting at Ramboll, Ramboll Management Consulting to be exact. And over the last number of years, both within the perspective of sustainability and circular economy, I've been deliberating with myself what it all means, and mainly helping clients unravel what it all means and how can they embrace the opportunity that I believe that exists out there to transition to a circular economy.
Before we get into the topic of circular economy, how did you get into circular economy yourself? How did you end up in this field?
I think my own background, I have master's degrees in energy and environment, and although not hugely technical, I come from a technical background and worked originally a long time ago in waste management, for example. And I think waste management is the precursor to the circular economy. So that was, I suppose, my first exposure to it. But then as I evolved my career in Ramboll, I think the topic started arising maybe 6 years ago. Progressive clients that wanted to understand what it was, that wanted to be front runners in what it was, evolve away from waste management. And then by default, within the Ramboll family, took more of a leading role around what it meant to us and thus for our clients.
Yeah. And of course, you've great access to very strategic clients and very large clients within many different industries coming from a Ramboll perspective. That's great.
But that's also a problem.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the main challenges for, when you're a big company like us, with multiple dimensions, so environment, buildings, water, architecture, management consulting, etc., trying to pin down what it is for a multi-sectoral company isn't easy. If it's abstract and fluffy from a one-dimensional perspective, it gets even more abstract and fluffy when you're trying to look at it through multiple
silos or whatever.
Yeah, so it's a huge opportunity, but also it's not straightforward.
No, I'm sure if it was straightforward, everybody would be doing it as they say, But taking that example of that multifaceted organization, most huge organizations have the same problems then. So while you're looking inwardly, trying to figure out solutions, you can also reflect that externally to your clients as well and say, actually, you know what, we've figured out parts of this. This is what we believe the direction should be for you. So while you're testing internally, you can then externally present that.
I think the main issue, not the main issue, but the challenge and opportunity for us as a company with it is that when you have all these multiple dimensions to it, people look at it through their dimension.
Yeah.
If you're in buildings division, you're looking through buildings. If you're in oil, you're looking through water. If you're in energy, through water, through energy.
Absolutely.
And so on. So the challenge for us is how do you cobble together all those different visions into a holistic vision, because you're coming back to what our clients are invariably multidimensional.
Yeah.
So if we can harness our multidimensional approach to circular economy, it absolutely propels us into a leading position to be the key provider to multidimensional companies.
And that leads us nicely into, can you explain to us what circular economy is?
Firstly, I'll start with the holistic notion of sustainability and then circular economy, because I think there's a lot of confusion around the term. I think it's seen by most, and to a certain extent it's true, that it emanates from the sustainability agenda. So you look at, you have climate, you have biodiversity, you have water, you have the human element, workers in the value chain, affected communities, human rights, and then you have circular economy. I said about 2 years ago at a Ramboll internal conference that my ambition was to unfluff the fluff. It's a fluffy, abstract term, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Because it's about materials. It should just be so basic and understandable, because you can weigh this stuff. It shouldn't be abstract or remain so. And that's primarily to do with the definition. You have multiple definitions all saying the same thing, multiple paradigms, schools of thought, different, but invariably saying the same thing. For me, it's probably 5 or 6 core themes or elements. So number one is design out waste.
Yeah.
So 90% of waste comes from the design studio, particularly from architects and engineers. What they decide to do determines ultimately the amount of waste that will be arise. Extend lifetime. So lifetime extension and durability would be the second principle. Simply maximize value by keeping stuff in the loop as long as possible. Thirdly, use waste as a resource. There's a phrase that I like, waste is only waste if you waste it.
Yeah.
And it really resonates with me.
Yeah.
Fourthly, facilitate regeneration. I don't necessarily be regenerative, because that can be a stretch. Facilitate it, particularly in the building sector and infrastructure. Fifthly, operating systems. It's the king of cliches. Systems thinking, blah, 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 but it's actually really, really true.
Yeah.
Because the value chains and understanding the relationship and the interconnectivity becomes crucial. And finally, and not least, is value creation and capture. Economy is the operative word. It's getting lost. So back to your definition, and with it being a sustainability agenda or an economic paradigm, some schools of thought would actually say it's an economic paradigm and not a sustainability paradigm. So those 6 themes. Now, you ask somebody else, you might get 8.
Yeah.
You ask somebody else, you might get 10 R's.
Yeah.
Ellen MacArthur will have the butterfly diagram, all saying the same thing, all a little bit different. So I land on those 6. And when I speak to a manufacturer, a contractor, somebody in the buildings value chain, that's what I tend to focus on.
And I know our topic here, being circular economy and inventing construction, is we're part of the construction industry, but we had a conversation years ago about the simplicity of this, and we talked about apparel, like clothing, and the reality of the circular economy within that environment. It really doesn't exist. Cheap clothing is a kind of in conflict or in a contradiction with that. We buy something, we wear it once, we dispose of it. There's nothing circular about that, is there? The idea of that clothing should last us our lifetime is really something kind of far-fetched for a lot of people. And that's what you really are talking about. When we buy a product, it should be lasting our lifetime or even longer. And it's not something that we buy, procure, and throw away. That there's a movement that right to repair, right to fix.
Yeah. That's not a movement; it's legislation now in certain instances. But
that's part of the circular economy ethos.
But I think I'm not an economist, but there's an economic, the basic economic principle is to make something for as cheap as possible, to last as long as possible, and to sell for as much as possible.
Yeah,
that's essentially the linear economy in a nutshell. And you talk about fashion, that's what it is. And cheap fashion, but also fashion in itself. I think, this is a construction podcast, not a fashion one.
Maybe we change it. Anybody interested in
exactly.
Over to fashion?
But the main issue is, with respect to the fashion issue, it's populist.
Yeah.
So, we all wear clothes, and the construction industry is seen as bland. and boring. Cement isn't exactly sexy. Okay. Yeah. But with the fashion industry, we're all wearing mixed materials. If I look at the label of my shirt without even looking, it's probably mixed polyester and cotton or something, whatever it is. Okay. So ultimately, it can't be recycled because you can't unravel it. Yeah. So then you'd use a simple example of designing out waste. Is if I'm a textile manufacturer or a clothing manufacturer, you use single material.
It's back to basics.
So it's back to basics. So like I can't expect to recycle a shirt if it's got polyester, if it's got cotton, and it's got wool, whatever, without being an expert. Yeah. So again, in the design studio, make a decision, just cotton. End of story. Just cotton. And then by default, cotton can be recycled with cotton, can be blended with other cotton, et cetera, et cetera. That's a simple example, designing out waste when it comes to a textiles perspective.
Yeah. So really it's the entire value chain we're talking about here, because if you talk about the construction industry, the architects and engineers are really at the back end of material design. They're just selecting material. They're not part of that design material. For example, you're talking multi-material components. That really is down to the manufacturer at the end of the day, who's kind of manufacturing that material. And our materials have become so engineered now that if you were to read the label of materials, like it's a huge list. So if it is back to basics, I wonder what the impact on resources would be if we were to do that.
I think when you look at value chains, because I can quite clearly see it in my head, the buildings one, because I use it a lot. At the top, you have investor or public agency that drives it. Then you have a developer, asset manager, asset owner of some sort. Then you have the contractor. Then you have the manufacturer, and then resource extractor actually over here. And then somewhere in the middle, service provider. So architect, engineer, whatever. But the clear link between all of them is that if you were at the bottom, the manufacturer, you could invest heavily in recycled content in an element. It raises the price a little bit, and then you realize that there's no pull for that product. So you go out of business. So there's also a phrase that I use, what is it, like long-term, transition for short-term bankruptcy. Companies can't go out of business. But the interlinkage between all of those elements in the built environment is highly complex. And so who is the one dictating the terms of the value chain?
The customer.
And ultimately it's at the top. The manufacturer is only reacting to those above them. The contractor is reacting. So if those at the top of the chain begin to change behavior and force it, for example, a public agency, if you're putting to tender a bridge, a tunnel, hospital, whatever it may be, and you put into the procurement process certain standards, certain material, then people begin to react downstream. But it's highly complex. And then I always say that the contractor themselves are the ones most exposed, albeit, the value chain is quite blended these days. You have multiple entities that would be a contractor, but also be a developer, an investor. And even to some extent, you have contractors that are also manufacturers, let's say prefabricated homes. So they're complex entities now, particularly the larger enterprises. But the interconnectivity between it all and getting that collaboration, but then this issue that I talked about, creating and sharing value, there's got to be a financial incentive for one element to move, and that ultimately has to be pulled from another element, and then you're waiting for this domino effect to happen, and it doesn't. So it remains in limbo. And then a final point that I would make about it, it's way down by history. Of all the economic sectors, the built environment is definitely the one that's just way, way down. I mean, I if you were to compare it to IT or electronics, it just moves so fast. This is just so slow. But also there's a waiting game. Who moves? Who doesn't move?
Being so slow, so weighted down, and so tied by legacy, it means there is also a hell of a lot of opportunity. Small impacts have huge change right now in our industry. Hopefully in 10, 15 years' time, those small changes have been implemented. We need to go to the next layer of change. Has all that opportunity. We'll come back to the apparel. If we all wanted to be sustainable, we'd wear, locally produced single material clothing like wool, for example. The industry would shift, but the reality of economics is that, as you mentioned, lower price, fast product, et cetera, et cetera. But can you explain something to me then in relation to circular economy? How does that differ sustainability? When we talk about sustainability and sustainable materials, isn't that one of the same?
Of course, it's intrinsically linked. And it is a part of sustainability. I'm not brave enough to say that it's not. It is. Yeah. But it's also more. Okay? So I think when you look at the interconnectivity between, I would call it resource use and circular economy. So for example, many of the listeners would have heard of the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Yeah. They put sustainability into 10 topics. So climate, biodiversity, water, pollution, and resource use and circular economy in the environmental, and then in the S, own workforce, workers in the value chain, affected communities, and consumers and end users. And then finally, governance. But if you look at, so it is in there, in EU legislation, it's got its own topical standard as a core component of sustainability. But unlike some of the others, it's intrinsically linked with the others. Yeah. And in fact, they're all somewhat connected, but I think that circular is intrinsically connected with all of them. Because if you take climate, so classic example, 45% of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from how we extract and how we produce. Within the built environment, if the built environment is responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, 10%, well, actually 1/3 of that 30% is actually extraction and things. Okay, so huge climate issue. Embodied carbon is a consequence of materials. Biodiversity, 90% of biodiversity loss is from, again, how we extract and how we manufacture. Water in itself is a resource. So actually water in itself could also sit in circular economy because of what it is. And of course, and how we manufacture and how we produce is what causes pollution in the first place. So our behavior with materials, or relationship with materials, how we use materials, domino effects into all of those. And then over on the S, by the way, or the forgotten cousin of sustainability, which is changing, by the way, is now becoming the big brother, right? It's growing up quickly. Workers in the value chain is intrinsically linked to, again, how we extract and how we produce. So ultimately, how we extract, how we produce our relationship materials is, I think, the common denominator across not all of it, but most of it. Yes, there's this being kind of naive understanding out there that it's this kind of fluffy paradigm sitting out over here, because, and in fairness, a lot of these entities that have been really driving the agenda, of course, they're correct to do so, and the fantastic institutions, but I still struggle then, as working in a technical organization, that very clever people still don't see the connection sometimes. And then just final point. So you said, that it's linked with sustainability. It is. But then over here, on the other side, let's say if you saw circular as the sustainability element and then economy as the economic element, it is about value because materials, you can weigh it. It has a cost.
It's measurable, right?
And there are business models that can maximize that value proposition. But if we focus purely on the sustainability agenda, yes, it's nice to do, but there's got to be a value proposition for it really to escalate. Hence, the economic element is just as important. So I would say it sits in the middle, but fundamental to the sustainability agenda, but much more.
But to achieve a real circular world, we need a huge shift in consumerism and how we're actually buying, procuring, what our needs and wants are as a society. Like, it's not something we can just put policy in place and expect an industry to shift. We as people need to shift. That's the biggest challenge in reality.
But policy helps.
Well, it does, yeah.
But I think
it's a sticker, a card.
It's about behavior, whether it's personal behavior or whether it's company behavior. I always use the example of washing machine. Who cares whether it's secondhand, but yet nobody's buying secondhand washing machines. We want the news and newsy or whatever it is. So with your flat screen TV, people want the new flat screen TV. So companies are the same, value chains are the same. So yes, there has to be a cultural shift. But we also understand that culture moves very, very slowly, unless there's an emergency like COVID. Click overnight, people's behavior flips. But the issue is, you need policy, you need value. If there's a value proposition, It draws, but the value proposition isn't enough without the policy.
Without
so
policy,
it is.
yeah,
it comes as a couple.
Yeah. A two-sided
it is.
Like it has to be in order to drive it. Stick in a carrot. We have to have the stick in order for societal shift. The carrot can be there, but nevertheless, we might not move towards it in mass numbers in order to make that impact.
For example, if you go into a board of a company tomorrow and you say, transitioning to a circular economy, it's great for sustainability. It's great for the environment. People will say, yeah, great. I don't disagree with you, but it's going to cost me money. Yeah. So again, it's back to the value. But they need two things. Policy on its own will become a compliance issue, which you don't want it to be. Value on its own needs a lot of convincing. But if you can come in with the two, yes, you have this legislative driver pushing you to do this. Yeah. But if you embrace this legislation and be a front runner, you will create value. So it's about coming at it from both perspectives.
And again, that leads nicely in now into how it's affecting industries. How is circular economy and new legislation affecting industries? For example, like the construction industry. We talked about ESG, CSRD, for example, in our reporting directive. The requirements now, we really now formalize and categorize sustainability, if you like, as something that has a real focus for large organizations, the boards, et cetera, et cetera. But how is then circular economy feeding into?
But even you use the word ESG, even the way that causes confusion. ESG, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. ESG ultimately is a financial term that has been now embraced by the private sector. But I have a slide that has kind of these legislative issues over the last 12 months, and I think over the last 24 months, like when I was working on this 4 years, 5 years ago, even from my own company's perspective, they're saying, okay, Pat, when's it going to happen? When's the pull going to happen? I said, it's going to be this. It's going to be this year. It's going to be this year. And then without the legislative pull, it doesn't happen. Yeah. Okay. But now, in the last 2 years, so just in the last, and again, correct me, your listeners can email me if I get the dates wrong. Yeah. But there's speaking specifically, looking at something that impacts the buildings value chain. So there is now a circular economy taxonomy, which buildings and infrastructure is in. That's only in force since the 1st of January 2024. And only listed companies have to deal with it at the moment. And even then, so that's got another 2 to 3 years before it really begins to settle what it is, right? I think it's great. It's flawed. It creates a definition, right? Then you got the CSRD, which I mentioned. Again, only in force since the 1st of January 2024. And again, only for listed companies. Non-listed will be tracked for 2025. In there's a European Sustainability Reporting Standard for resource use and circular economy. What that is going to do, it focuses, it forces the reinterpretation of a relationship with the terminology, because all companies will have to look at resource inflow. Yeah. So we look at waste as circular economy. It's a byproduct, but it's what comes in first. So it forces that rethink. That's two. Then the eco design regulation. That's a massive game changer. It's got a staggered transition period, but digital passports will become compulsory for big elements in the built environment, in particular steel. Yeah. Then you have the construction products regulation. Again, 2024, updated. It hadn't been, I can't remember the exact date, but I think it's from 2011, the original one was. Every single product, so glass, flooring, roofing, concrete, cement, steel, everything that's considered has to have circular elements, has to have a digital product passport again. So all of those things just in the last 12 months.
Yeah. So it sounds like the last 12 months.
12 months.
Huge shift in the industry.
However, some of it is in force, but chaotic, and some of it doesn't come into force until next year, and then some even in 2026. Yeah. So you're going to see this 3-year period of where the prominence of circular economy escalates exponentially, facilitated hugely by legal definition.
Yeah.
Because one thing that I didn't mention is ISO launched 3 standards in June.
Okay.
So they also didn't really have standardization. Standardization of definition and standardization of measurement.
Yeah,
so they've released those. So when you bring all that together, the landscape is unrecognizable.
Yeah.
But then for companies to grapple with what to do with that landscape, how to respond to that landscape is going to be huge. So you're going to see this massive escalation, but highly confusing in the short term.
Yeah, the entire industry is transitioning. So there's only a few experts available, and we all need to upskill and train and educate. And we've been saying for the last number of years within our discipline of quantity surveying is that the key metric and the key facilitator for us will not be the dollar sign, the euro, the pound, the Danish krone. It'll be carbon in the future. That will be the currency of discussion when we talk about change management and so on. It'll be carbon first and currency in terms of pounds and euros secondary. Because with all of this shift towards sustainability, circular economy, all the reporting requirements, it's going to flip the industry completely in reality, which is it's super exciting. So when we sit here again in 4 years' time or in another 15 years and we chat about this, we won't recognize the industry that we used to work in.
I think if I was to go to 2030, okay, I think you're going to see, I do think 24, 25, 26, and even 27 would be highly disruptive years in struggling with this legislation, in understanding what it means. But I think by 2030, all organizations, regardless of value chain, but particularly the built one, because as you said, it's linked back to carbon, firstly, but also biodiversity is creeping as a massive changer as well. So people's behavior and the interlinkages and understanding the connectivity between these elements will be 100% clear, crystal clear. Whereas now it is still a bit muddy.
It's the journey we're on.
So I do think that'll be crystal clear. I think the understanding of resources and the value and the wastage, I'll call it wastage rather than waste, of value will also resonate. And I think basically the efficiencies, because this is a word that gets lost in this. Ultimately, it's common sense. It's about efficiency. And I think the understanding efficiencies, but the passport is key enabler, because you cannot take, particularly in the built environment, cannot take a product if you don't have the recipe in the back of it, the ingredients, and
understand.
The digital product passport is going to be a massive enabler for this.
So looking at the future, the landscape is going to look much different in 2030 than it is today. All of these new requirements and policies are going to affect how every company within the entire supply chain in the industry of the construction industry is going to be affected by this. And for the first time, I would say, is that it's the responsibility of the end user to understand where that product material is coming from. It's the responsibility of the manufacturer to understand where that raw material is coming from. And we now need to understand our entire supply chain of materials. And this is, for the first time, it's becoming the responsibility of the end user to do this. And this is where the big shift from our perspective is, from within construction, within our profession as QSs as well, because we're managing this information for the end user.
I think one thing that I didn't mention, another acronym, the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which again was only adopted in April, May, but anyway, late spring, which comes into force, I think, 2027. And for large companies, it does focus on large companies, but ultimately it focuses on the environmental and the human, and you're responsible for your value chain. There's no more saying, well, get someone to sign off in a declaration. Oh, they signed something. It wasn't my responsibility. They said it do X. No, you need to understand, well, is there a risk involved? The CSRD also forces this. So once people recognize, or companies recognize that they are responsible for tier 1, even 2, 3, 4 behaviors change. But also there's a thing that's, about the future. You asked about 2030. Actually, I'll just talk about something for a second. If you jump to 2035 and you look at what does our circular future look like? And I love there's a quote, I can't remember the exact quote, so I'm paraphrasing. And it says when we, look at strategy, we project from the present out.
Yeah.
Okay. But this quote is great. Like whatever the future looks like, it certainly doesn't look like today.
Yeah.
So why on earth do we project out from today? One thing. So if you look at the future of the built environment in 2035 through the technical lens, a economic lens, a socio-cultural lens, i.e. like the usability of of its relationship with the building, political, so what instruments are in place, environmental, linking to the carbon and climate element. Yeah. The world is going to look totally different.
Yeah.
And when we look at sustainability, we tend to react, well, what will the heat be? What will sea rise be? What will X, Y? But ultimately, the economy will evolve to adapt to whatever it's in. Yeah. That's what mankind does, it adapts. So I challenge the construction value chain to picture what 2035 will be like. It will look like a certain way.
Yeah, it will be different.
Which means that either A, you evolve to fit what that looks like, or B, you go out of business, right? Yeah. But our inability to picture what it will look like is extraordinary. And I put it down to because it means that people need to rethink who they are as companies, because ultimately it's not going to look like today.
Yeah.
So if we project in 4-year blocks, away you go, it's great. We never have to really worry about it. Yeah. But there's inevitability that this will be. So you'll have smart membranes. You will have huge incentives and disincentives from a tax perspective.
Yeah.
You will have a complete change of a relationship with how we pay, particularly with commercial real estate, about maximizing value, and offices being empty half the time. Yeah. So that will completely change. So are you going to thrive in this? Are you not?
Yeah.
And ultimately, but if you draw out a picture that you think is reasonably accurate and you acknowledge that that's what it looks like, it means then you also have to change.
Yeah.
And then people go, shoot, we have to change.
Yeah.
You do. And ultimately companies, this shift slowly.
Yeah. It's a very interesting message and it's very simple. The reality is the future is not going to look like it is today.
No.
That's just the reality.
But just on the final point, and then on this point, because I think when I started thinking about this futures thinking with respect to the circular economy, it becomes so clear to me, because if there's inevitability about X and what something will look like, why on earth do we not evolve? And of course, it's the chicken and egg, like, do I go first? But then who's going to want my product if you're a manufacturer feeding the system? Like in 2035, everybody's going to want your product, but who's going to want it in 2028, 2029? And that's the continuous balancing of this. Yeah. But the last thing we'll say about the future in 2035, we do look at it through the prism of sustainability elements, like how climate will impact and biodiversity, so on. But we don't look at it enough from the perspective of how our economy will behave then. Yeah. And that's where we need to be transitioning to. And very little put into that, and very little strategic thought by the construction industry and the built environment to long-term visions rather than 3-4 year planning periods. Yeah.
It'll be a huge shift for organizations. And as we talk about kind of the circular economy and sustainability topics, it becomes more evident that every organization will have teams of people that will be managing the requirements around whether it's reporting or strategy or implementation or technical requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And when we look at Denmark as kind of, I would argue, one of the leaders within sustainability evolution and strategy and legislation, we can then reflect on Ireland, us being both from Ireland, of course, and looking at Ireland, and people are still asking about, but will this come? Will it happen? It's, again, the future.
It's a cultural issue there as well.
Yeah, but the future is not going to be what it is today. It's going to look something completely different. So it is coming. It is going to be different. And it's a case of we prepare ourselves now for that future, or we're left behind when that future does come for us. And it's been a main topic of discussion for us here when we talk about quantity surveyors and being a very traditional discipline, working in the same way we've worked with it since 80s, the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, and not transitioning into digital, into more effective ways of working, doing more with less, right? That's really what sustainability and perhaps circular economy ethos is about. Doing more with less. Yeah. It's the same comes for people. We need to evolve so that we're doing more with the availability of resources, both human and natural.
But ultimately, it's a profit-driven value chain.
Yeah. Yeah,
And,
sure. Yeah.
you know, I mean, ultimately, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Like textiles. It's no different. It's not different. It's about making money.
Yeah.
Okay. And on circular economy respect to if it's about making money, then you have to attack the want to make money. Yeah. And there's a way that I talk about it. There's the consequence of action and the consequence of inaction. And you explain it to a contractor or any element in the value chain that, you know, if you invest in X, you could make Y. You could, you know, and it'll make the world a better place. Sure. So the board says, oh, that's great. We like the idea of making the world a better place, but there's still a huge question mark of whether we'll make money. You attack the consequence of inaction. That's the default position.
Yeah.
So do nothing scenario. You attack that, and it's easier to quantify and monetize consequence of inaction. So you could say, rather than saying you could win X contracts, you can speak more high probability that you will lose Y contracts. Yeah. You will lose X percentage of market share. You will, rather than you may. Yeah. And the consequence, attacking the consequence of action. So when you're in a money-driven value chain, in fact, in fairness, every value chain is money. It's money-driven. It's the reality of it. You got to attack consequence of inaction so that your market position will be lost, your reputation will be damaged, which all, again, can be monetized, attacking the intangible value of a company as well as the tangible value of a company, which is the reputation issue on the intangible part. So you can attack it. But if you can come at it from both, consequence of action, you will lose X amount, but then the consequence of action will, you'll eliminate or mitigate the risk of losing, but also you get a plus upside.
Yeah, there's a gain factor.
You got to speak to it to that terms.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because while we have one side of the industry evolving and innovating, like digitization, sustainability, we also have a particular side of the industry that nothing's happened, the legal side, the procurement side, contractual component of that. And what we're seeing now is how we're merging both of those, this historical, traditional approach to how we kind of evolve or communicate within a project delivery versus all of this stuff and we now need to do and we now need to report on. Like, this is the challenge. This is another part that I see is going to be affected over the next number of years, you know.
But just one thing I was thinking of there, I remember I had a colleague from the UK, and about 3 years ago, he was heavily passionate about the circular economy. And he actually said to me, maybe the problem is in the word itself, circular. And if we had called it materials economy, would have resonated more. So, for example, you spoke of Ireland. You were there. I presented at the Irish Green Building Council's meeting at Croke Park in May. And I started my presentation with 5 covers. First cover, spiral staircase. Like, that's not a representation of the circular economy. It's going to do with a circle. No. and it's particularly a concrete staircase. But that's what everybody uses.
It's completely
so it's, and even the idea of, I think that the issue of circular as a term has caused the confusion because then they went through the different covers, if you remember, and said, oh, this is a circle. Now, because it's a concrete circle, then I had a picture that everybody uses of a circle in a forest. Now, again, what's that got to do with the circular economy? A circle, in fact, if anything, you're cutting down trees. So it's non-representative. People use it all the time. Then you'd have a park that's in a circle. Again, it's irrelevant. Then I checked this before it came down, and then I had a slide of recycled aggregate. It's not sexy, but it reflects the circular economy. So, well, that's not sufficient. It's close enough, but it's not sexy enough. So, and then I had a picture of the world of Volvo and Gothenburg. Magnificent building, high content of recycled, locally sourced wood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I said, that's better representation.
Than your spiral staircase.
But a problem with it is the term. And if you had called it materials economy, then bingo, it's materials. I can lean into that. It removes the fluffiness. But that analogy of the slides was so real. And that's why I did it that day, because it said, we're stuck with spiral staircases. And it's got nothing to do with it. Of course, it does to a certain extent to do with closing loops, but invariably it doesn't.
But the reality, I would say, is that the concept is, well, it's relatively new. It's been around for 30, 40 years, to be fair. The 50s or 60s, I think it was kind of originally.
But the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who she is the kind of pioneer of the modern day thinking, was founded in 2010.
Yeah.
So it's
relatively new.
So we have new 15 years, but it's been almost sitting, but to a certain extent, it's been a nice to do philosophy rather than a materials issue that becomes a must do.
Yeah. So there's a lot of training and education that's necessary. And talks like this will help people, of course, to understand it. I'm learning every time I speak to you about this. I'm learning a lot on it, because specialists like yourself are in depth in this every day within your
But I think
business
the problem on the
environment.
educational issue, I think, is fundamental. But I also think that it's so multifaceted. I think you can specialize, but there's no such thing as an expert, really.
Yeah.
Okay. But you can specialize in and specialize in understanding its dimensions, its interconnectivities.
Yeah.
But it's not just education; it's also the ability to articulate it.
Yeah.
So you can, if you educate to a certain audience in a certain way, it won't resonate.
Yeah.
So for it to resonate and embed in the brains, you've got to be able to pivot in your audience, how you articulate the value, the why, and the why is different to everybody.
Yeah.
It's different to every person in the value chain. It's different in every sector. And that's a challenge in itself. If you come at it from a one-dimensional perspective, again, it'll fizzle out.
So is it a case of there's a multifaceted approach here? It's not just education within universities, it's education within the board that you spoke about.
If you mentioned universities, circular should be in all curricula.
Yeah.
From political science to engineering to business. Yeah. It crosses everything. And then when there's a term that I like called collective intelligence, which requires different perspectives, and circular is 100% a collective issue. So if you come at it just from a technical engineering issue, it pitters out. If you come at it purely from a strategic or business element, it pitters out. But you need the multidimensional, as well as the social cultural, as well as the environmental. It's a collective understanding, and it's a collective, I hate the word paradigm because it's not, it's more than that, but it's a collective paradigm. But unfortunately, very few companies have that collective intelligence because let's say you'll have one or two, but you won't have the 4 or 5 elements. But it requires that, because if you come into a contractor talking bricks and mortar, people in the company will resonate. But if you talking about strategy and euros, dollars, kroner, another element, ideally you have the two going in together, talking the two languages, and there you get to think, but you don't get enough advisory providing the multidimensional aspect to it.
And it's interesting, it seems to be a topic that is coming up over and over again, which is that collaborative across silos, across organization, across specialists approach to this new sustainable way of working, what we would like to see the new industry within construction industry.
But I do think, though, that it's only getting a bit of lip service. There was an example of a pretty well-known company, and I asked the CSO, why are you doing a circular strategy? Well, because we have to.
Have to be seen to be.
Didn't really know what it would entail,
yeah,
but they had to have a circular chapter and some nice graphs and nice imagery just to show that they're there. But really didn't know what the depth of what it should be. Yeah. We're just doing it because they're doing it. And that's a problem in itself.
It's the same as your ESG strategies that we're seeing, this overarching macro approach to
and then
the
you
projects.
Look at them and there's nothing in them.
No one knows how to deliver them technically, you know. And so there's going to be that gap. Again, another kind of evolution over the next number of years within our industry. But Patrick Moloney, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure as always.
It's been a pleasure.
Hopefully we'll get you back in the future, you know. Thanks very much for listening. There's a LinkedIn link below in the show notes. We would love to connect with you.
We hope you enjoyed it and have you with us in the next one. Thank you very much.